Pooja has had amazing experience in the product space. She's been doing product for the past 20 years with some amazing companies, including Microsoft, Expedia, Karib, and Katopi. Today, she also leads on her own company that consults product leaders within the space called Products Global. Um, Pooja, let's start off by talking a little bit about what does product mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So product to me, as you mentioned, I've been doing product for 20 plus years, and it's evolved quite a bit since when I started. So probably the idea of what it was versus what it is today has changed quite a lot in my experience. I would say product back in the day was about how do you actually decide what to build. And now I would say today it's more about how well do you understand your users of the product, and how do you make sure that you're creating experiences for them which get them to really engage with your product and continue to compound your growth.
Yeah, amazing. So, I mean, we've had quite a bit of a conversation earlier about product-led growth, which is the topic of today's fireside chat. Um, what is product-led growth, and how do we understand it differently from how we understand product more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think of product-led growth as a specific strategy that will actually allow you to leverage basically your product experience to continue to drive higher growth without having to pour extra resources into it. And ultimately, what product-led growth really how it's really defined is how do you actually get your users to experience the value that your product is bringing to them as quickly as possible within their product experience. When they do that, they'll actually experience that personally, and they're more likely then to continue down the journey with you and invest more with you. So product-led growth is really about the strategies that allow you to enable people who understand what your product is, understand the value of it, to actually go ahead and experience it as quickly as possible, and therefore continue to help you drive your growth.
I wonder, from your experience, especially within the region, how often do you see companies adapting a product-led growth strategy versus a sales-led growth or other frameworks for their growth strategy?
From what I've seen, and sort of my clients that I work with as well as just looking across the ecosystem, it is quite common, especially for B2B companies, to adopt more of a sales-led strategy. So sales-led growth is really more about letting your marketing do the awareness, get some leads in, qualify those leads, and then hand them over to your sales team to go ahead and close those and contract those. Versus product-led, where you actually have your marketing team still bring in those customers, but actually what you're doing is you're then grooming them and nurturing them then to be self-served into onboarding onto their platform. And what I see more often than not here in this region is the B2B companies, like I said, will primarily focus on a sales-led growth strategy. And the B2C companies, which product-led growth lends itself probably a little bit easier to, tend to not focus on a go-to-market strategy at all. They kind of oftentimes they'll build something without really thinking through how is this one acquisition or this one experience that we're presenting to the customer the first time they're interacting with us going to lead to continued growth within our product. So it's something that's often overseen, probably because the idea is to get something to market quickly and test it out. But the missing component is actually if you build that product-led growth strategy into that MVP you have a higher chance of seeing the potential of your product growing and impacting than if you don't.
Challenge you on that a little bit.
Okay,
so you talk about the differences and kind of the different approaches, and you did mention that sometimes when you're not necessarily building product-led growth into your strategy, you're really thinking about getting to market very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was the goal. The goal is to get to market as quickly as you can.
Yeah.
And I kind of think about the MVP or a minimum viable product to be largely about how can you as quickly as possible get to market.
Yeah.
So how do you think about how does product-led growth play into that, especially at that early of a stage?
Yeah. And let me caveat in the sense that product-led growth isn't for every company or every business. It's really if your company lends itself to this kind of approach and strategy. To answer your question, let me give you an example. Say you had a product that you built and you said our MVP is to get people from, get people into our product and using our experience. But you've never actually thought through how you're going to show them that experience in that first instance. So you may actually be creating a leaky bucket. If you're using product-led growth, you're actually thinking very tactically about what steps are they going to take to actually get that experience right off the bat so that they can actually take that. You can actually take that, and that will be a better read of whether people are actually valuing that experience. Yet, if you don't actually build that concept into your journey, then you may actually be landing them somewhere where they're not even getting the experience you're trying to give them. So the value that you promise them is not being perceived in that experience intentionally. And therefore, you're not actually seeing if they are actually responding to your MVP in the way that you expect them to, because you're promising them value and they're not experiencing it because you never built it into the journey.
Okay, that's very interesting. Let me see if I understand this correctly. So I kind of think about, especially when we're talking about MVPs, a lot of it is about validating assumptions.
Yes.
Right. So you have a theory about what's a problem that exists in the world and how you can solve that problem.
Correct.
And what you're saying is oftentimes what we do when we're building these MVPs and really rushing it into the market, we're not necessarily building a product that will help us learn anything about the assumptions that we've made or the problem at hand.
Yeah, so if you apply what we call the scientific methodology, for example, to product, even in your MVP stages, so the scientific methodology is more about sort of having your observations, using your data, your user research, to then form a hypothesis, right? Which is what you talked about. If we do this, this will solve this person's problem, right? This user's problem. Right. That if you do X is the value that you want to drive for them. Mm-hmm. The only way and then you kind of round it out by having your test and then to your MVP in this case, and then seeing if your hypothesis is validated or not.
Right.
But that part of the if hypothesis, which is the value part, if that's not something they experience very early in their experience on your product, you may think, wait, that's not right. Let's tweak this, let's tweak that. So you have to be very, very careful about making sure your test is running in a way that validates your hypothesis. And that value that you put into your hypothesis is very front, right, and center in the experience as quickly as possible. Or you just might have people coming into your product, they get stuck in part of the sign up process, or you land them somewhere where they're not even realizing the value because they have to go through 10 more hoops to get there, or come 10 days later, they'll experience it. Then you'll say, well, my MVP is a failure. Like it didn't actually work. But actually what you didn't do was put it in the right order. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think one way that you described it earlier was perceived value versus experienced value.
Correct.
Yeah, what I'm hearing here is you want to get to experienced value as quickly as possible. You want to get the users to really get to experience that rather than kind of just sell them the idea of what they would eventually experience down the line.
Correct, yeah. Even if it's just a little piece of that experience, right? Like you don't have to give them the whole shebang. They just have to get that little bit of delight where they understand, okay, I'm getting the value. Whatever you promised me is what I'm experiencing. And you want to close that gap as quickly as possible from the minute they understand what you're offering to the minute that they experience it.
Right. And I mean, I think sounds cool and all, but should we put it into practice? Like, what would it look like? What is an example of maybe a product or assumption that you could make? What would it look like if you were to build it the, I guess, non-product like growth way? And what would it look like if you have products like early on?
So oftentimes what I see is, when you're building an MVP and you think, okay, I got that user is going to go through my sign up path or my onboarding. I'm going to ask them everything I want to know about them so that I could use that data whenever I need that data to do whatever I need to do to get them to use my product. But what you actually need to do is the opposite. You need to ask yourself, well, exactly what information do I need from them in order for me to show them the value right off the bat. And you basically want to make it as short as possible a time frame that they come in, they sign up, and they experience that value. And there are a few different strategies you can use, or tactics, I should say, or design methodologies you can use to get somebody who's on your platform, which isn't always, the most simple thing to do, but simplifying that experience as soon as they're in there, as soon as they've taken those steps and you've considered them onboarded, is very, very critical. And so you can do things like what we talked about today, where you can have tool tips, for example, to show them exactly what 2-3 things they need to do to start seeing value in this and guide them through that process. If you have multiple values in your product, you can have a startup path where you let them self-select. Hey, I'm interested in, setting up my products in your platform. Or I'm interested in looking at the data of what my competitors are doing. You give them 2 paths, let them self-select so they can get to the value very quickly. They're giving you the signal already of what they're interested in, for example. Things like that. You can do, there's plethora of different ideas of once you get somebody onboarded, how do you actually get them to see the value?
Can you share with us a favorite example of yours? Whether it's something you've worked on or something that we might all be familiar with?
Yeah, so I would say one that I use quite often is Canva. And people kind of forget this because oftentimes long-time Canva users, you forget your onboarding journey. But that's great because you're so into it now that why should you remember that? They did a great job of that, right? So in Canva, for example, you land there and they ask you, who are you, in terms of they give you different options. So they say, are you a teacher? Are you a designer? Are you this or that? Depending on what you pick, they almost customize your experience for you. So you actually have that value shown to you sooner rather than later. So they don't let you stumble through it and say, okay, what kind of template do I need? What should I look at? They just, as soon as you click it, your experience is modified so that you are able to get to your end goal very quickly.
Yeah. I also think back to, I don't necessarily remember the specific products, but it's an experience that I come across often where, I'm trying to explore a new product, see whether or not it's a good fit for me, and I hit a wall. And it kind of gets frustrating because you're like, okay, I don't really know if I want to invest more time to really understand what this product is all about, understand whether or not it's going to, help me in any way, help me solve whatever problem I have at hand.
Yeah.
Because, it's just, do I really want to create an account right now? Do I really want to enter all this information before I can really get a glimpse of what could it be like for me to actually really utilize this product?
Yeah, that's a great example of products that probably aren't doing product-led growth well, right? Because you want to be able to get the very minimum information from someone to get them to start using your product. And then if you have a paid product, great, give them like a limited version for free for 2-3 weeks. I'm sure we're all customers of products that do that. And then you basically want to get them to experience that value right away and walk them through it. If it's more complex, we talked about empty states today, for example. An empty state is, imagine a dashboard, for example, where you set up your product, you log in and there's nothing in there. But then there should be a prompt or something that tells you the bare minimum you have to do to start seeing value with that product. So there always has to be almost a back and forth. You have to anticipate your user's next step and what prevents them from dropping off at that stage. And then make it very clear and simple what they need to do to continue using your product and seeing value from it, to your point.
Kind of like resolving any dead ends the user might come across.
Exactly.
So I want to get a bit more into what that could look like at a later stage of building the product. But before we get into that, you mentioned earlier that product-led growth is not necessarily for everyone. It depends on the sort of product or the sort of startup that you're building lends itself well to product-led growth. How would you describe, the quote-unquote ideal customer profile for product-led growth as a strategy?
Yeah, so I think, and one other thing I will say, like you've got product-led growth and you've got sales-led growth, and both don't need to be. It doesn't need to be an either or. You could combine both into your strategy. So the best type of products I would say that lend themselves to product-led growth from a digital perspective are digital products, like SaaS products and things like that. You also see versions of this in physical products from time to time. But the best way to think about this is if you have a SaaS product that is targeted towards small and medium businesses, end users in businesses, and enterprises, you could have a product-led growth go-to-market as well as a sales-led growth go-to-market. Some customers just need more hand-holding. There's going to be larger sales cycles. You're going to need to put dedicated resources in closing those contracts. While others, you continue to have a low cost of acquisition through your product-led growth channel. So you don't need to spend that much time. The sales cycles are shorter, et cetera. So the types of companies that would probably only rely on product-led growth are those that probably focus on smaller customer sizes. And the ones that can still benefit from them are ones that have a broader type of customer base, large and small.
When you're referring to smaller customer sizes, you're referring to the B2B side of things.
B2B and even consumers, like end consumers, So Canva is another, like, again, I'll bring Canva as an example. I'm not a business, but businesses use it too, right? I use Google Suite, G Suite for my business, but I also use it for personal use. So there's this idea of like what we're all very familiar with like freemium products, right? Where you get to try it for free, and then you can upgrade after a certain point in time, or you get limited functionality for free, but you get exposure and you can unlock more if you pay a subscription. Those are all really great strategies for product-led growth in a way, because you're letting somebody experience the value before you're actually unlocking everything for them.
I was telling you earlier before the fireside chat began that in my own personal experience, I've had to learn the hard way that even when we are familiar with I guess product strategies with these concepts and frameworks, it's very easy to slip into the tendency of kind of thinking that, oh, that is a great strategy, but it doesn't necessarily apply to me. Mm-hmm. I can kind of see an extension of that towards, kind of companies that might actually greatly benefit from product-led growth, mm-hmm. But can easily fall into the trap of thinking, oh, actually, it's not for me. We actually need to go about it the sales way, or product-led growth. I mean, even if it's not mutually exclusive, would not necessarily be a good investment for us. Mm-hmm. And I completely understand that it's not necessarily for everyone, but do you have any recommendations of, how you could identify the difference if you might be in that kind of position where you're thinking, okay, maybe it's not for me, where you might actually challenge that and say, mm-hmm. Maybe you should actually consider it.
Yeah, I think one great way is, and what's fundamental to successful product-led growth is being able to track all your data of usage. So even just looking, if you're tracking your usage data, you get somebody coming into your funnel or landing on your page if you'll have it, which is their first point of entry. You have to understand kind of where are they dropping off before they actually get to what you perceive as value. Mm-hmm. And if you're finding that you are getting quite a lot of traffic from qualified leads onto your first experience, but you're not seeing that follow through, then I would question whether or not you need a product-led growth strategy or not. And most likely you do if you have a digital handoff. Because if you're getting qualified leads and it's taking you a sales force to go and close on those leads, scaling will also be challenging for you. So thinking about scaling, I know they always say you shouldn't think about scaling when you're really thinking about starting up, but there is no harm in actually thinking about scaling and putting that into some very foundational growth levers into your product right off the get-go. So really thinking about, it's almost the idea of scaling in this case, I would say, is about avoiding drop-offs. Right? You're spending money to acquire customers. How do you make sure those customers are bringing value back into your product? And that's growth as well, right? So that is growth and that is scale. And so in this case, you really want to make sure that's the foundation of what you're building on. And if you look at your data and you're seeing drop-offs along the way, you probably could gain some benefit from product-led growth strategies, or even testing them out to see if they would be of value to you. There are very few startups that are going to go and sell to an enterprise right off the bat. You usually grow into that, right? So product-led growth, I think, is a great foundation for startups.
I want to a bit deeper
Yeah.
into that. So you talked about, how utilizing product-led growth is, is it kind of goes hand in hand with thinking about scaling your
Mhm.
product. We're also all familiar with the idea of do things that don't scale, right?
Mhm.
It's something that is a very prominent idea within the product world. How do you balance between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. So doing things that don't scale is fine for validating certain hypotheses, right? Do you have the right feature for this kind of functionality? At that micro level, it could be okay to do things that don't scale, or at a very early stage where you have this you have a concept and you just want to verify that and validate it in the market. That's fine. Is there an actual need for something like this?
Yeah.
But then when you're actually investing in technology, because we all know tech is such an expensive investment, right? You want to make sure, just like you do when you invest in marketing to acquire a customer, that that dollar is being stretched as far as it can to bring you as a business the value back. And so it's exactly what you said. It's a balancing act of what kinds of things can you qualify as do it scrappy, don't worry about scaling it to validate. Is that validation then going to feed into your more scalable product journey? And so you can do that. You can do small tests to kind of verify and validate certain types of features, functionality, experiences that then can lead to the bigger investment where you spend more money driving traffic to the end-to-end experience, driving traffic to, making sure that more people experience that value and are sticky. They stay longer, they retain on your product.
So, okay, so you're saying that when you're validating something, it could be scrappy, do things that don't scale, but once you've validated it, once you've gained that learning, implementing product-led growth as a strategy allows you to scale that and make the most out of every dollar.
Yeah.
But then earlier, you also talked about building, building your MVP
Yeah.
with that
Yeah.
mindset
Yeah.
in mind. What does that look like when you're when you're at a stage where you're scrappy,
Yeah.
whether it's with a specific feature or your product as a whole?
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in, again, making your dollar stretch as fast as it can, as far as it can. And that's because, like I said, marketing tech is expensive, right? So you have to really be diligent about what are you testing in a scrappy way versus what is actually going to be valuable driving these strategies through. So I'll give you an example. If you are just testing, hey, we have this concept and we think that it'll resonate with users, and that's the problem you're trying to solve for your user, right? Which is, will people, like what we call a smoke test, right? If I put a button over here, are people going to click on it, right? That button doesn't need to go anywhere. You're just telling people if you click here, you're going to you're going to get X experience, right? Whatever the experience is. So if you click here, we're going to be able to make sure we give you the lowest price every time you log in. That's testing out whether or not there's a need for something like that, right? You don't need product-led growth into a strategy like that. You're just validating a hypothesis based on if people, like, it's more of a micro hypothesis. If you are bringing new customers into an experience that you want them to, the end-to-end experience that you want them to engage in, so your entire platform, that's where I would say just at the very beginning when you're thinking about onboarding, product-led growth is very important very important when it comes to many factors of your product, but particularly onboarding, I think. Because onboarding is where you really want to close that gap and make sure they see the value of what you promised them. So in the smoke test, you're trying to say, you're saying the value you're going to get if you click on this button is you're going to get all the lowest prices, for example. And you just want to see, are people interested in getting all the lowest prices, right? So you see, did people click on this? You're giving them nothing in return. They may not even change the thing. You may just have something that says, thanks, we'll coming soon, right? When you actually build that into your platform, and that is the purpose of your platform, you want them to be able to sign up and see that value as soon as they're done signing up. Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, let me see if I understood it correctly. So I think it sounds like there are always maybe parallels that are running when it comes to your experimentation, the different features that you're building up. So the core of what you're providing, or something that you've already validated and has become part of the core product, is something that you'd always want to kind of think about. How do you close that cycle? In the way that in the way that it can help you continue growing and scaling, whether it's during the onboarding process or at other parts of the product, which is something that I'd like to also understand a little bit better. But then there are always maybe experiments that you're running to understand whether or not there is even value to be added there before you went out and created something that can bring that value.
Yeah, that's how I see it. And that's how I've seen like a lot of compounded growth happening, because there are experiments running at all these different levels. And then whatever is the winning experiment, you're applying it to your platform and rolling it out.
Right. And so you mentioned that onboarding is a kind of a focus for or a big chunk of what product-led growth feeds into. What are some other areas of product that
well, we touched on one. Experimentation is a really big thing. So if you're running experiments across your product, you will see your growth compound, because what you're doing is, and this is probably for more mature companies, as you get more mature, you can run multiple experiments at a time. And then whatever is winning, you roll it out. So then you're starting to compound, hey, this had the positive impact on the business. And if you're running multiple experiments, you're learning multiple things at a time, right? Because they all begin and end and running in parallel. And so you keep rolling new things out. You keep experimenting. So that's one thing. And the other thing is really understanding how data plays a role in your product, and taking the data that you're looking at and you're collecting and using that to continue to optimize your product. So for example, in the product world, we have many loops that we talk about. So we talk about our data loop, which is, being able to take the data from an experience and apply it, change your model and apply it back in. So it makes it better for everybody using the product. Viral loops, for example, which is how do you get your product from from getting one person to compounding it to using two people using it, right? How do you get it to spread? You've got like social loops, which are more like the idea of somebody publishing something. So social networks use this a lot, and other people engaging with it, which then brings that psychological motivation for you want to publish more. And this is all backed by data, right? You're looking at how data is used to drive higher and higher usage. And then you've got your habit loops, which is when somebody is basically not using your product, how do you get them to keep coming back and using your product continuously? And all of these, again, are there's elements of data and psychology in both of these, because your end user is always going to be a human in this case. And so you need to make sure that you're using your data to present them with options that are going to make them keep coming back.
This is interesting, because when I think about growth, I typically think of customer acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm hearing right now is customer acquisition is one part of it. Another part of it is retention, I guess.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on how the two go together, and what does it look like to also focus on retention when you're thinking about growth? Or why is that even important to think about?
Yeah, so I love to use a leaky bucket scenario, right? You acquire a customer and they don't come back, right? That's probably the worst thing that can happen, because you just spent money on someone. Or even worse, actually, that's not the worst thing that can happen. You acquire a customer and then you have to spend money to reacquire them. So, from a fiscal responsibility perspective, you want to make sure that that customer you acquire is going to come back, is going to be retained. And then these are all again, I call it sort of like sustainable growth through product. And these are all the, not tactics, but all of the strategies you can use to keep people coming back. And I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Like, the way I like to think about building product is by compounding growth. You always want your user, the one user you spent money acquiring, to do two things. You want them to continuously use you so that they're continuing to contribute to your business goals. But you also want you want that one customer that you acquired to equate to two customers. So you want them to almost bring in another person. And this isn't your simple referral program. It's really just the idea that your product should be so good that that person can refer another person, even verbally, to it. Or you build a network effect where, in order to use your product, they have to invite somebody, because that is the the point of the product essentially. And these work really well in social networks more than anything else. But even B2B products, for example, can add social elements to them, which will enable this kind of growth.
I think we often hear that one benefit of focusing on product and product-led growth is kind of you're reducing the cost of acquisition to pretty much zero. I mean, you could disagree with me on that.
Yeah.
Actually, would you agree?
I still think there's a role for marketing, right? If you still need to acquire customers somehow, customers who don't know about you. And even like the biggest companies in the world still advertise and do marketing, right? There's still that element of it. But it's about really making sure that those customers you do acquire are acquired once and for all, and you're getting the most out of them.
Okay. I mean, I think something that I was wondering as well is, when we're talking, maybe with B2B, it's a bit more sales. With B2C, it's more kind of marketing and acquiring customers that way. We talk about, you're putting money into acquiring customers. Typically, when we're thinking about acquiring customers through product, we're not necessarily counting the dollar amount of what that actually costs. So, how do you understand whether or not your product-led growth is actually cost effective?
Yeah.
Or you would have ended up spending the same thing, just instead of directing that money into sales or marketing, you're redirecting it into your product.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think one good thing to start thinking about, and this again goes into tracking your product end to end, is your customer lifetime value right off the bat. So if you're able to track every user who comes in, and you can understand again, like, did they come in and drop off right away? There are two questions you're going to ask yourself. One is, why did they drop off, right? And then you can have a whole bunch of hypotheses. It could be your product. It could be that you didn't have the right product-led growth strategy in place. It could be whatever it is, right? And then the second question is, how do I get them to come back, right? Without paying for them again. And and I think basically you're basically going to want to just sort of look through that entire flow and understand, how do we resolve that essentially?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, partly. I mean, I think what I'm hearing here is you're able to understand a little bit better what's actually happening with your customers. Mm-hmm. So if it's not actually being very effective, you understand why not, and you're able to fix that, which might be more difficult to do with. I think it would be a lot more difficult to do with maybe marketing sometimes. Yeah. I think understanding data is across marketing channels is a little bit more difficult to capture. I think it could be complementary as well.
Yeah.
But I think with sales, it also tends to be more qualitative than quantitative necessarily. Does that align with kind of how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately you want to know, like, if every customer you're, because like with marketing, for example, it's probably a little easier to track because you can put attribution back to your marketing channels, right? So you know where somebody came in from. And then if you implement your tracking and tagging correctly in your data through your product, you can actually follow that all the way through to did they convert or not. So you can understand which marketing channels are working for you and which aren't, right? But when you're actually tracking that user, not just that person coming in, but the time they come back over and over again, and you're attributing lifetime value to them, that's when you know that you probably got a product that's functioning really well. Like, it's a healthy product that's delivering on the value it's promising to deliver on. And, it again depends on your target. What's a great healthy LTV for you, right? So oftentimes at very early stages of businesses, I see them focus on acquisition, right? And then as soon as the marketing dollars stop, they're like, wait, why is nobody using my product, right? Because they never built that into the product itself. And not only that, but they're not tracking the lifetime value, because if you track the user journey across everything, you'll start to understand why people aren't using it without asking people, because you start to see where they're dropping off, and then you can form your hypotheses and generate based on that. So
all right, I mean, this is very interesting to learn. I think one question that comes to mind right now is, how do we go about implementing this, practically speaking?
Yeah.
What does that look like? What are the first 3 steps that someone listening to us today
Yeah.
could get started on?
Yeah. So I think if you have a product, a digital product specifically, a great way to look at it is your user journey. You should really map out in very granular detail what your user journey is. And if you just start, and if there's one place to start, I would start at the very beginning. You acquire a new customer. As soon as they interact with your brand, what happens, right? And break that down into every single step they take. Then you want to look at that with a very critical eye and ask yourself, what steps am I making them take that they really don't need to be taking right now, right? Is there steps I can eliminate? Are there steps that I can delay to a later time? And get them to that point of value very quickly where they then experience the value of the product that you want them to experience. So in your mind, here's what I want, what I'm telling people they should experience when they first hear about me, and then give that to them. Even if it's a fraction of that, something that delights them very quickly, get them really quickly to go through the sign up path and experience that value right away. And you've probably taken your first step towards product-led growth if you do that.
Are there any risks associated with not building with a product-led growth, especially for products where it really calls for it?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest risk, I think, is kind of like what we talked about before, where you could be building something which is a really great concept and the value you're delivering is actually very impactful. But because you've not put it in the right part of the journey, or even exposed it a little bit at the right part of the journey for somebody to experience, they're not going to necessarily be likely to come back and experience it. So you're creating a leaky bucket in that case, where you're acquiring customers, but you're not really optimizing your product for them to experience the value, and then you're therefore going to have to reacquire them or keep feeding that bucket.
We still have roughly 10 minutes or so before we open it up to questions, anything else that you'd like to add?
I guess I'd just say overall, from a product-led growth perspective, it's not just the one only thing that's going to make your product successful. It's a very important part of a product, but there's just so many other things that go into. We touched on a few of them, like experimentation and really understanding your growth loops for sustainable growth. But also kind of really approaching it the right way, doing your user journey right off the bat, really making sure you understand the problem you're trying to solve and it's a legitimate problem. There's so many factors that go into it, but product-led growth is a popular topic, and it's really, really something that can be executed well when done very intentionally and drive really great results. So I'm glad we got an opportunity to speak about it today in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience?
Hi. Do you have any advice for starting to monetize a B2C product and still trying to maintain I'd call it maybe like marginal value that the user gets out of it?
Yeah. Can you give me a little detail about the type of B2C product it is?
Yeah, sure. It's an AI personal styling app.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
In that respect, if you can think about what are the elements, again, that the user will be able to experience for free that will entice them to then be upsold to the full experience. So what I would do is, if I were to start experimenting with what is enough to show them, for them to kind of want to pay for more, right? And so you almost have almost kind of like a freemium model, or try before you buy kind of model, where you can start doing that, but you'll have to really figure out what that sweet spot is. And also, for how long will you allow them to experience that potentially before you make them upgrade? So you can have like a 3-month free trial if you really believe that that's what it takes for somebody to recognize the value. Could be down to 1 month or even 2 weeks, right? Or it could be, hey, as your personal stylist, AI personal stylist, you're going to get X, Y, and Z features for free. But if you want even more, like credits or whatever the case is, you have to pay for it. It's a subscription type model.
Thank you for the session first. And my question is about, I understand that PLG is about growth, right? But would you agree with me that it's also useful, since it includes experimentation and user journey mapping and so on? It could be also useful with achieving the product market fit.
100%. Yeah. That's why when we were talking a little bit earlier about MVPs and stuff, like it's really hard to validate whether you got product market fit, not exposing the value of your product to the user right away. So you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Thanks very much. That was really great, fantastic, and I like the concept around perceived experience versus actual experience.
Yeah.
And I used to work quite closely with Revolut in London, which were a great example of a product-led company, and they would focus only on product. They didn't advertise for the first 5 years, and they had this concept there called minimum lovable product, and they wouldn't release anything unless everyone all agreed they loved it and were recommending it to their friends and family. And I thought that was a really great concept, and I think it's really applicable for a lot of the startups here. But to your point earlier is that sometimes a startup can be limited in terms of the funds or resources that they've got, and do you think it's better to narrow down the features that you've got on your product and focus on doing them well, or try and put all your features in and just market the hell out?
Yeah, I it's so tempting to do the latter, because you're kind of like, you see this end North Star vision of everything. You're like, well, this would be even better if I added this functionality or experience onto it. But, starting, I would say, looking at all your experiences or features that you have and really understanding what's going to drive the highest value is the starting point you want to build and expose, and then build onto it. Because once you validate that, if that's the highest priority and you validated that, and the rest is pretty much, using that same experience, but you're leveraging the growth from that. Because you're saying, okay, we are hypothesizing, and based on your user research and all the discovery you do, that this is the one feature that's really going to get people using it. And I would also apply this idea of how do you pick a feature that not only are people going to love or find high value in, but is also going to help you compound growth at the same time. And that, I think, is the winning combination, right? It could be something that is going to be valuable, but in order for them to use it, they're going to have to add another person to use it effectively. Then you've just got two people for the price of one, and they're both going to see value out of it. So using those compounding strategies can really help, but definitely choosing a slice of it versus the whole shebang is what I would advise when you're going out with the MVP. Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you think about attribution when you have multiple channels of engaging users. So if all you're doing is product-led growth, it's great. You can see if it works or see if it doesn't. But if you do that plus paid ads, plus SEO, plus a few other different things, how do you think, or how have you solved attribution to say this was because of product-led growth versus this was because of a marketing campaign that you happen to have run simultaneously?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when you have this kind of different channels for marketing and bringing traffic into your product, oftentimes the product-led growth journey starts when they're on the product, when they've actually touched the product. So the marketing is really just to get the traffic to your product. And so you can understand which channels are working better for you versus not based on the attribution you're applying to the number of users you get to your product. And then it's up to your product and the how good your product is to get people through to full conversion, right? So if you're not just product-led growth, but if you're saying like product-led growth, let's say after your onboarding journey, you're showing people value and they're taking the next step towards doing whatever you want them to do next. But ultimately, when it goes down the funnel, they're not converting, then you might hypothesize that SEO was the best channel for us because it drove the best qualified users to our site or app or whatever. And from that, our PLG, our product-led growth strategy, was amazing because of the people who got to our product, 5 of them selected their next step to go in and take that next step of the journey. And then as they went into checkout, for example, 90% dropped off. It tells you where in the product the issue is. But I would separate attribution to the product-led growth as well to qualify whether or not you're bringing in the right targets to your product is experimentation, right? You're just going to have to change your marketing targets and stuff like that to see, how many are actually going through the funnel based on your hypotheses, and then eliminate one after the other. And the one thing I can't emphasize enough is that when you do go into experimentation and you start using different experimentation methodologies, to try to keep it as pure as possible, because then you're going to get your outcomes very clean, right? If you try to run 5 experiments at a time, you're not going to know what's really causing people to pass through or kind of stop at a certain place. So that's kind of what I would also recommend, or keeping your buckets very clean if you're doing experimentation.
So it's one thing that you've learned. And the second part of that question is, what's the biggest misconception about product-led growth that you are so sick of people asking you? And you answered today and you put it to bed.
Okay, cool. So I'll answer the second question first, which is the biggest misconception of product-led growth, and frankly, any product methodology it applies to, is you just build it and it'll work, right?
People will come.
People will come, yeah. Or people will use it the way you intend for them to use it. You have to be very intentional about what you want the outcomes to be. So your job in building your product is to get the users you're attracting to do the thing that you want them to do when they're using your product. And so it has to be very intentional. You have to almost think about, the best analogy I can use is you let somebody into a mansion and let them explore, versus you give them a tour of the mansion. And you want to give them a tour. And that doesn't mean like a product tour or a demo tour. You want to make sure you're guiding them. You're anticipating they're probably going to arrive and need to use the bathroom right away. So you're taking them to the bathroom first, right? And then you're taking them to the kitchen to get a snack. Like, you need to really anticipate what they need and present it to them. So that's probably the biggest misconception. Your question was about the learning that I've had, right? The biggest learning I've had, and I don't think it came to me as a shock because I'm naturally curious about people, is that unless you really understand behaviors and psychology of humans, because they're the ones using your we're not all working with robots yet, but as of today, they're the ones using your product on the other side. Unless you really understand the psychology of what's going to get somebody to use your product, and validating that, you're probably gonna hit a lot of road bumps. So I think that behavioral sciences is just as important as understanding product methodology. Hand in hand, they create success.
To tie in the two questions, I think, to the first part of what you're describing, it sounds like that's the importance of being able to track and analyze and understand the data that you're collecting. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the second part of your response also is kind of pointing at the importance of having intuition that really drives the experimentation in the first place, and then also kind of drives your understanding of the data that you're collecting.
Absolutely. And intuition based on observations, right? And your observation, qualitative or quantitative, right? Your data will give you something, you'll look at something, you'll be like, okay, I'm observing. And I was giving Hayat an example earlier about when I was at Expedia. My first job there was to go and get people into the product every day. And first thing I did was go to their homes and watch what they were doing using our product. Like, literally stand behind them and watch them using our product. And just those observations gave me a lot of indication of what I needed to do to solve that problem. Yeah.
How much of that, in your experience, is acquired versus natural talent?
How much of the intuition?
Kind of.
I would say it's all, nothing is natural. Because I've heard so many people say, hey, we built this product because I have this problem. And then they realize they're the only person in the world who has that problem. So, so then they're like, can you help me now figure out, how do I get users to use this? And I'm like, well, what did your users say before you built it? And I can never talk to anybody. So it's a lot. You really do have to ground yourself in the data and the observations, qualitative, quantitative, before even going down that path. Yeah, we have our biases, our personal biases. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if there are any.
Just to confirm my understanding on one thing. So even for a sales-led growth, are we correct to say that it will also start with the same, let's say, product management approach at the end of the day? Still, you have to define the right requirements of the users, validate them, and reach the level where you have the product that you can take to the market.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, so the question, I guess, is at what point of time you probably have to move from product-led to sales-led? Is it the scale that you're looking after, or is it the complexity maybe of the product?
So I would say not all companies need to move from product-led to sales-led. And some companies probably will go sales-led and not product-led at all, right? So from a perspective of, if you say, look, I'm a startup and I'm going to start with small to medium-sized businesses and I want them to self-serve to get onto my platform, right? I don't need a sales team yet. You should probably optimize for product-led growth, right? To make your experience so that that time to value is as short as possible, right? But if you then grow into a stage where you're now dealing with the enterprises of the world, and of course they are much more high touch, you need somebody to form a relationship with them, you need somebody to take them through the process, their procurement cycles are much slower. That's probably where you need to employ a sales-led growth team. But then there are companies that start up as sales-led growth right off the bat, where they're working with insurance companies, where you need to knock on their door, for example, and get a meeting with them for them to even look at your product. But to answer your earlier question as well, the product methodologies on what you're deciding to do with your product, how you're prioritizing things, the fact that you really need to understand what the end user's problems are, consistent, regardless of whether you're using product-led growth or sales-led growth. If you have a product, you should be, for the success of your product, always be using those same methodologies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us here today, Pooja.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Before we wrap up, where can people find you?
LinkedIn, Pooja Vithlani. So my handle's LinkedIn/IN/Pooja Vithlani.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.